The morning Wilhelmina Boone drove her wagon into Colby Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, she was wearing a dead man's hat, and every soul on the main street stopped to stare. It was not an ordinary hat. It was a broad-brimmed, dust-colored Stetson with a leather band stitched in a pattern of tiny crosses, the kind of hat that a man wore for 20 years until it became more a part of him than his own skin. The hat had belonged to Reuben Boone, who had been Wilhelmina's husband for 7 years before a February fever took him in the dead of a hard winter, and she had placed it on her own head the morning after she buried him, standing alone at the edge of a frozen field, with the wind cutting straight through her grief. She had not taken it off since, except to sleep, and even then it rested on the bedpost within arm's reach, as though she feared the world might swallow her whole if she let go of the last physical thing that had anchored her to the life she once knew. Wilhelmina herself was 31 years old, with the kind of face that had been beautiful in girlhood and had only become more interesting with time and hardship. Her dark hair was pinned at the nape of her neck, and her eyes were a shade of brown so deep they appeared nearly black in shadow. She was tall for a woman of her era, with calloused hands that told the story of years of labor, and a straight spine that told the story of years of stubbornness. She drove a wagon loaded with the sum of everything she owned: 2 trunks of clothing, a cast-iron stove, a milk cow tied to the back, and a crate of laying hens that complained about the journey without ceasing. She had come to Colby Creek because of a newspaper notice that her neighbor's wife, 3 days before Wilhelmina had buried Reuben, had pressed into her palm with the urgency of a woman delivering scripture. The notice read that the Granger Ranch, some 400 acres of prime Kansas grassland with a solid house, a working barn, a well that had never run dry, and cattle, would be auctioned the second Saturday of April, 1882. The owner, old Clement Granger, had died without heirs, and the land was being sold by the county to settle his remaining debts. The starting bid was $600. Wilhelmina had sat at her kitchen table for 3 days after reading that notice, doing arithmetic on a piece of brown paper. Reuben had been a careful man, and despite everything the farm had cost them, he had kept a tin buried beneath the floorboard of the bedroom. She had found it after he died, and when she opened it she had wept for an entirely different reason than grief. There were $480 in that tin, in bills and silver coins, all of it saved in secret, as though Reuben had known something she had not, as though he had been building a ladder for her to climb out of whatever hole his death would leave behind. She had sold the farm in Missouri for another $310, sold the draft horse and the plow for $60, and by the time she loaded her wagon, she had $850 sewn into the lining of her coat and tucked into the crown of Reuben's hat. She was not a woman who acted on impulse. She was a woman who had calculated exactly how far $850 could carry her, and she had decided it would carry her to Colby Creek. The town itself was the kind of place that the railroad had kissed and then largely forgotten: a main street of weathered storefronts, a general store, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a livery stable, a small hotel called the Meridian, and a saloon called the Prairie Dog that did considerably better business than the church. The streets were unpaved and the spring mud was persistent, and the whole place smelled of horses and wood smoke and something faintly hopeful underneath it all, the way prairie towns always did, as though the flat horizon was a promise rather than a boundary. Wilhelmina pulled her wagon up in front of the Meridian Hotel and climbed down with the particular care of a woman whose back had been aching for 2 days. She tied her horse, looked up at the hotel sign, adjusted the brim of Reuben's hat, and went inside. The man behind the desk was a small, nervous sort named Percy Aldous, who spent a great deal of his life apologizing for things that were not his fault. He looked up when Wilhelmina came in, took in the tall woman in the dead man's hat, and blinked. "Good afternoon," Wilhelmina said. I would like a room for 2 nights, and I would like to know where exactly the Granger Ranch auction will be held on Saturday." Percy told her a room would cost 30 cents a night, and that the auction would be held at the ranch itself, which was 7 miles northeast of town on the Harlan Road. He told her this while looking slightly alarmed, which she had grown accustomed to, and she paid him for 2 nights and carried her own bags upstairs. That evening, she sat on the edge of the narrow hotel bed and counted her money for the 4th time. $850. She was not a wealthy woman by any measure that the year 1882 would recognize, but she was not without resources, and she was not without nerve. She set the money carefully back into its hiding places, lay back on the thin mattress, and set Reuben's hat on the bedpost. She stared at the cracked ceiling and thought about the ranch. 400 acres, a well that had never run dry. She thought about the life she could build there, the life that felt necessary now rather than optional, the kind of life that was not about recovering from what she had lost, but about becoming something she had not yet been. She fell asleep with that thought still moving through her like a river current, and she slept more soundly than she had in months. The next day was a Friday, and Wilhelmina spent the morning walking the length of Colby Creek's main street and taking the measure of the place. She bought flour and salt and a small wedge of hard cheese at the general store, where the proprietor, a thick-armed man named Donnelly, watched her with the openly speculative look of a man trying to place her in a category he recognized. "You here for the Granger sale?" he asked when he wrapped her cheese. "I am," she said. He studied her. "Lot of men coming in for that one. Good land, that. Clement kept it well." "So I understand," she said, and paid for her things and left without offering any further information about herself. She was examining the exterior of the saddle-maker's shop when she heard the argument. It was coming from the far side of the livery stable, 2 voices raised, and one of them had the particular quality of a man who was very tired and very angry but trying to stay reasonable, while the other had the quality of a man who had stopped being reasonable some time ago. She should not have walked around to look. She told herself this even as she did it. On the other side of the livery, 2 men stood in the mud. One of them was short and red-faced, and appeared to be the sort of man who believed that volume was a substitute for logic. The other was taller by half a head, lean and broad-shouldered, with a face that was weathered to a kind of rough handsomeness that came from years under an open sky. He had dark brown hair and a short beard going to copper, and his hat was pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he had done it himself to keep from losing his temper. He was holding a piece of paper that the red-faced man was trying to take from him. "The contract says 30 days venable," the tall man said, and his voice was low and deliberate, the kind of voice that did not need volume to carry. "I have got 3 days left. You cannot remove my cattle from that pasture until the 30 days are done." "The Granger land is being sold tomorrow, Winslow," the red-faced man said, "and the new owner is not going to want your scrubby longhorns grazing his grass." "The auction is not until tomorrow," the tall man said. "Today is Friday, and I have a legal contract with the county for grazing rights through the month. I suggest you go talk to your lawyer before you do something we will both regret." The red-faced man snatched at the paper again, and this time the tall man let him have it, because they both seemed to realize simultaneously that Wilhelmina was standing at the corner of the building watching them. The red-faced man looked at her with immediate dismissal, the automatic glance of a man who does not consider a woman in the picture, and turned and walked away, taking his grievance with him. The tall man looked at Wilhelmina for a moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, a kind of adjustment, as if he was recalibrating his immediate understanding of the world to include her existence in it. "Pardon the disturbance, ma'am," he said, recovering himself with what she recognized as good manners rather than performance. "That man was trying to steal your contract," she said. He blinked. "He was trying to take my copy of it, yes." "You should keep a second copy somewhere else," she said. "My husband used to say that any document worth having was worth copying twice." The tall man looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something else but lived in the territory between. "Your husband sounds like a sensible man," he said. "He was," she said, and the simplicity of it, the past tense worn smooth by months of use, settled between them quietly. "I am Homer Winslow," he said after a moment and touched the brim of his hat. "Wilhelmina Boone," she said. "I arrived yesterday. I am here for the Granger auction." Homer Winslow looked at her then with the full, honest attention of a man who was genuinely surprised, and she could see him working it out. The woman alone, the dead man's hat, the Granger auction. He was, she estimated, somewhere in his mid-30s, and his eyes were the particular gray-green of sage before rain, and she noticed this the way she noticed the color of the sky, as information rather than sentiment. "So am I," he said. "Bidding for that land, I mean." "Then we may be competing with one another tomorrow," she said pleasantly, and picked up her parcel from the ground where she had set it. He watched her walk back toward the main street with an expression that a man passing by would not have been able to name, but that contained, in its depths, the beginning of something that would take time to understand. The morning of the auction was a clear, cold April Saturday with the Kansas sky scrubbed a pale blue above the greening grass. Wilhelmina rose before dawn, dressed carefully, and put Reuben's hat on with a deliberateness that felt ceremonial. She had sewn the money even more securely into her coat the night before, and she had a smaller sum in her skirt pocket for easy access. She hired a horse from the livery, having arranged it the afternoon before, and rode out northeast on the Harlan Road as the sun came up golden and thin. She smelled the Granger ranch before she saw it, the particular smell of good land, turned earth and creek water and the green hay scent of new grass. When she topped the low rise and saw it spread below her, she felt something in her chest that was not quite longing but was its close cousin. The house was solid, a square, well-built structure of native limestone with a covered porch and real glass in the windows. The barn was large and well-maintained, painted red, which meant Clement Granger had cared enough to spend money on paint. The grassland rolled away in 3 directions, and in the distance she could see a line of cottonwoods that meant a creek. She rode down toward the gathering. There were more men there than she had expected. She counted, roughly, as she tied her horse, and came to about 30, which meant the notice had traveled farther than just the local paper. They stood in clusters in the yard, talking in the low, evaluating way of men who were all thinking about money and trying not to show it. Several of them looked at her when she dismounted and walked toward them. Several of those looks contained the frank and irritating assumption that she was there accompanying someone else. She was not accompanying anyone else. She found a place to stand near the stone fence post at the edge of the yard, where she could see both the auctioneer's platform and the faces of the other bidders, and she stood straight and quiet with Reuben's hat shadowing her eyes and waited. Homer Winslow arrived 10 minutes later on a sorrel horse, and she noticed this without meaning to. He scanned the yard when he dismounted, and his eyes found her almost immediately, which surprised her a little and did not, at the same time. He nodded to her across the distance with the precise gravity of a man acknowledging a competitor, and she nodded back. The auctioneer was a county official named Denny Fisk, a large man with a speaking voice like a church bell, who climbed up on the back of a wagon at 9 o'clock and called the gathering to attention. He described the property in official language: 412 acres of mixed-grass prairie, a limestone house, a 2-story barn, stock pens, a well of reliable depth, and creek access along the western boundary. He described the cattle, which numbered 43 head of fair quality. He stated that the estate debts required a minimum bid of $600, and that all bids must be in cash or verified bank draft payable to the county. "We will begin at $600, Denny Fisk said. "Who will give me $600? 3 hands went up immediately. What followed was an auction that Wilhelmina would think about for years afterward, not because of its duration, which was perhaps 45 minutes, but because of the quality of feeling it contained. She had never bid at an auction before. She had attended farm auctions with Reuben, had stood beside him while he raised his hand for equipment or livestock, but she had always been the one beside, never the one acting. Now she stood alone in the yard, and when the bidding reached $720 and the field had narrowed to 6 men and herself, she raised her hand for the first time and said, clearly and without any tremor in her voice, $750. The effect was remarkable, not in a dramatic, theatrical way. There was no gasp from the crowd. But there was a particular quality of silence that settled over the yard when a woman's voice entered the bidding, the kind of silence that is not quiet but is made entirely of men recalibrating their understanding of what was happening. Several of them looked at her. The red-faced man from the livery, who she now knew was named Venable and who had apparently come to bid himself, looked at her with an expression that was so openly contemptuous that it bordered on comedy. Denny Fisk, to his considerable credit, did not miss a beat. $750 from the lady in the gray coat. Do I hear 8? Venable came back at $800. A man she did not know came back at $850. Homer Winslow, who had been bidding steadily and calmly from the other side of the yard, raised the figure to $900, and she saw his jaw set as he did it in the way of a man who was beginning to feel the ceiling of his resources. The unknown man dropped out at $900. Venable came back at $950 with the gleeful energy of a man who expected to win. Wilhelmina looked at the house. She looked at the cottonwood line along the creek. She thought about Reuben's tin under the floorboard, all those years of his careful saving, and she thought about what he would say to her right now. And what she knew he would say was the same thing he had always said when she hesitated, which was that hesitation was just fear wearing a disguise. $1,000, she said. The yard was entirely silent for a full 3 seconds. Venable's face went from red to something approaching purple. He looked at her with genuine fury, the fury of a man who has been made to feel foolish by someone he did not take seriously, and she met his gaze steadily from beneath the brim of Reuben's hat and did not look away. Homer Winslow, on the other side of the yard, was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. It was not anger, and it was not resentment, and it was not the contempt that Venable wore so openly. It was something closer to recognition, as if he was seeing her for the first time in a different way than he had seen her the day before, and what he was seeing was not a problem to be solved but a person to be understood. Denny Fisk gave it the proper time. $1,000 from the lady. Do I hear more? $1,010, $1,100. Do I hear $1,100 for this fine property? He looked around the yard with professional patience. Venable clenched his jaw and said nothing. Homer Winslow was still looking at Wilhelmina, and after a moment he lowered his gaze and looked at the ground, and she understood from this that he had reached his limit and was choosing not to exceed it. I have $1,000, Denny Fisk said. Going once. Going twice. He raised his gavel. Sold to Mrs. Boone. The sound of that gavel was the sound of the rest of her life beginning. There was a low murmur through the gathered men, the particular murmur of a crowd that is collectively surprised. Venable turned and walked away without looking at her, and she noted his departure the way she would note the departure of a bad weather system, with relief and without regret. Several of the other men came forward to congratulate her with varying degrees of sincerity. Denny Fisk climbed down from the wagon and shook her hand with what appeared to be genuine pleasure, the pleasure of a county official who has just seen an auction go 15% above minimum. She paid him from the money in her coat, counting bills out with steady hands, and he gave her the deed and the stock papers and a receipt, and she folded them carefully and put them inside her coat against her chest. She was standing near the stone fence post, letting the reality of what had just happened settle into her bones, when Homer Winslow walked over. He stopped a respectful distance away, turned his hat in his hands once, and looked at her with those gray-green eyes. "Congratulations, Mrs. Boone," he said. "Thank you," she said. He looked at the house. "I have been trying to buy this land for 2 years," he said. I had $680 saved. I bid everything I had. She did not know what to say to this, and so she said the honest thing. I am sorry. I know it is a hard thing to lose a bid. He shook his head. No, what I mean to say is that you earned it. He looked at her then with a directness that was not rude but was very honest. You walked in here alone and you outbid every man in this yard, and I think that deserves to be said plainly. She looked at him for a moment. He was not flattering her. He was not performing magnanimity. He was simply stating what had occurred, and there was a quality to his honesty that moved through her carefully constructed self-sufficiency like a key in a lock. Your cattle are still on the western pasture, she said. You have a grazing contract through the end of the month. He almost smiled. I do. The contract says the end of April, she said. My deed takes effect today. She paused. You may keep your cattle on the pasture until the contract expires. I have no intention of turning out a man's livestock over 3 days. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was complex and quiet and contained several things she did not yet have names for. That is generous, he said. It is sensible, she corrected. Moving cattle unnecessarily causes stress to the animals and damage to the grass. He did almost smile then, and it changed his face in a way that she noticed and filed away and told herself she was not going to think about again. She rode back to town to collect her belongings from the hotel, and by mid-afternoon she was driving her wagon out the Harlan Road toward her ranch. Her ranch. She let the words sit in her mind and felt their weight, which was enormous and real and slightly frightening, the way that all important things were slightly frightening. When she arrived, the sun was moving toward the horizon, and the limestone house was bathed in the particular gold light that Kansas afternoons made out of flat land and low sun. She unhitched her horse and led him to the water trough, which was sound and full from the spring rains. She tied her milk cow to the fence and let the hens out of their crate into the small pen beside the barn. Then she walked to the front door of the house, put her hand on the wood, and stood there for a moment. I am here, Reuben, she said, to the air, to the hat, to the man who was not there and somehow was everywhere. I am here. Then she went inside and started a fire in the kitchen stove and began to build her life. The first weeks were brutal in the way that all important beginnings were brutal, not cruel exactly, but relentless. There was so much to do that she fell asleep each night within minutes of lying down and woke each morning before the light with the day's work already organizing itself in her mind. The house needed cleaning from cellar to ceiling. The stock pens needed repair. The barn had a section of roof that had developed a worrying bow over the winter, and she needed to understand the pasture rotation that Clement Granger had used before she could know whether the grass would support the 43 head of cattle that had come with the place. She also needed help, and this was the thing she had not fully calculated, not because she did not know she would need it, but because asking for help was not something that came naturally to her. She had been self-sufficient since she was 15 years old, and Reuben, God rest him, had been a man who believed that a thing worth doing was a thing worth doing yourself, and 7 years of marriage to him had deepened that particular instinct in her. But one woman could not manage 400 acres and 43 cattle alone, and she knew it. And so, on her 4th morning at the ranch, she rode into Colby Creek and spoke to every person she could find about hiring a hand. She found 2 eventually. One was a young man named Eli Watts, 17 years old, the youngest son of a large farm family who had more children than work for them, and who was happy to take $1 a week and board. The other was a Mexican man of perhaps 50 named Santos Reyes, who had been working odd jobs around the county since the previous fall, and who turned out to know more about cattle and pasture management than anyone Wilhelmina had ever met. She paid him $1.50 a week, which was fair wages for the time, and she could see in his face the slight surprise of a man who had expected to be underpaid and was not. It was Santos who told her on his 2nd day that the western pasture where Homer Winslow's cattle were grazing had a fence break along the north corner that had been patched with wire that would not hold through the summer. The cattle will mix if it breaks, he said, looking at it with his arms folded. His and yours. Then sorting them out is a whole day's work and neither party will be happy. Wilhelmina rode out to look at it herself, agreed with Santos completely, and found herself the next morning at Homer Winslow's establishment, which was a smaller property about 3 miles to the east, a modest house and a good barn, and a pasture of perhaps 60 acres. Homer Winslow came out of his barn when he heard her ride up. He was in work clothes, which was to say clothes that had been through serious work, and his shirt sleeves were rolled and his hat was the same one from the auction, pushed back the same way. He looked at her with the attentiveness of a man who has been thinking about a person and is slightly startled to have that person materialize. "Mrs. Boone," he said. "Mr. Winslow," she said. "I have come about the fence on the north corner of the west pasture." He nodded slowly. "I noticed it before Clement died. I was going to mention it. Santos Reyes tells me it will not hold through summer. Santos is right. I can have it repaired before I move the cattle out." She had thought about how to say the next thing during the ride over, and she decided that directness was the only sensible approach. "I would like to propose something else. Your grazing contract expires at the end of the month, but I have more pasture than I can currently use. My cattle are only 43 head, and the Granger land was carrying closer to 100 before Clement's health went. There is capacity I am not using, and you have cattle that need grass." She looked at him steadily. "I am proposing a grazing arrangement. You pay me a fair rate per head per month, and your cattle have access to the south and east pastures. You and I split the cost of fixing the north fence, and we establish clear terms in writing." Homer Winslow looked at her for a long time. The morning light was coming sideways across the yard, and it lit the angles of his face in a way that she was not going to let herself think about. "That is a business arrangement," he said. "It is," she said. "Why would you offer that to a man you barely know?" She met his eyes. "Because Santos says it is the right use of the land, and because you bid everything you had yesterday and lost, and because you were decent about it, which not every man would have been." She paused. "And because I need the income while the ranch establishes itself, and a grazing fee is reliable income." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How much per head?" They negotiated for 20 minutes, standing in his yard, and came to terms that were fair to both of them. She rode home with a handshake agreement that would be committed to paper that afternoon, and she found herself, on the ride back, thinking about the quality of his attention when he listened to her speak, the particular way that he did not look past her or wait for her to finish in order to counter, but actually listened, the way that good men listened, and she told herself firmly that she was thinking about him as a business partner and nothing more. Santos looked at her when she rode in and said nothing, which she had already learned was his way of saying something very clearly. The fence got repaired on a Thursday at the end of April, and Homer came himself to help with it. He brought a good hand named Charlie Foster, who had arms like oak and could sink a fence post in record time, and she sent Eli out to help, and the 4 of them worked through the morning until the line was sound. Wilhelmina worked alongside them, handing wire and holding posts, and she was aware of the peripheral quality of Homer's attention throughout the morning, the way he was always at least slightly aware of where she was in the way that she was always at least slightly aware of where he was. And she thought that this was the way of people who were paying attention to each other. And then she thought about Reuben's hat, which was on her head, and she adjusted the brim and handed Homer a coil of wire without looking at him directly. After the fence was done, she fed them all lunch, because that was what you did for people who had helped with work, and because she had been awake since 5 and had made enough biscuits to feed twice the number. They sat on the porch in the thin spring sunshine, and Homer Winslow ate 2 biscuits and drank coffee and talked to Santos about pasture rotation with a genuine interest that made Santos visibly warm to him, which Wilhelmina noted as meaningful because Santos did not warm to people easily. Charlie Foster ate 4 biscuits and said almost nothing, which appeared to be his usual mode of interaction with the world, and Eli talked a great deal, which was his. When Homer stood to leave, he looked at her with the directness she was becoming accustomed to. "You make good biscuits," he said, which was not what he meant to say, and they both knew it, and she could see him recognize this immediately. "I do," she said, and almost smiled. He put his hat on. "Thank you for the arrangement, Mrs. Boone. It is a fair deal, and I appreciate it." "It is a fair deal for both of us," she said. "That is the point." He looked at her for a moment longer. "It is good that you came to Colby Creek," he said, and then he and Charlie Foster rode out of the yard, and she stood on the porch and watched the dust settle after them and thought that he had meant that too. May came in warm and bright and threw the prairie into bloom. The grass on the Granger land, which was her land now, her land, she still felt the strangeness and the rightness of it simultaneously, was coming in beautifully. The winter wheat Clement had planted along the north fields was heading out, and the cattle were fat and placid. Santos ran the livestock operation with the quiet authority of long expertise, and Eli was learning fast, and Wilhelmina spent her days in a state of productive exhaustion that she had come to recognize as the specific satisfaction of work that was entirely her own. She was also, in the evenings, learning things she needed to know. She had found Clement Granger's record books in the parlor, thick ledgers that documented the ranch's operation for 20 years, and she sat with them each evening after supper and read them the way she read everything, thoroughly, with particular attention to the margins where Clement had written his observations in a cramped hand. She learned about the creek's behavior in drought years. She learned which sections of fence had been replaced and when. She learned that there was a band of limestone just below the surface on the east rise that made it unsuitable for cultivation but excellent for building, and that Clement had quarried it for the house and the barn foundation, and there was plenty left. Homer Winslow came by the ranch twice in May, once on business, which was to bring the written contract Santos had prompted her to request, and once ostensibly to check on his cattle, though the cattle did not require checking on, and they both knew it. The second time he stayed for supper, which she had offered because it was getting late and the ride back was long, and because Santos had made a beef stew that was exceptional, and there was more than enough. They sat at the kitchen table, she and Homer, after Santos and Eli had eaten on the porch and gone to their respective sleeping places, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and the evening light was coming through the window in long warm bars, and they talked for 2 hours about things she had not talked about with anyone since Reuben died. She told him about Missouri. She told him about the farm there, about the years she and Reuben had spent building it up from a plot of rough ground, about the particular pleasure of seeing something you had worked for come into fullness. She told him about the 7 years of marriage, which had been mostly good, occasionally hard, and never dull, because Reuben Boone had been a man of strong opinions, and she had been a woman of equally strong ones, and the friction of that had been productive rather than destructive in the way that 2 good flints made fear rather than damage. Homer listened to all of this with the same honest attention she had noticed before. He did not rush to fill the silences, and he did not offer easy comfort, and he did not look uncomfortable when she spoke of Reuben, which some people did, as though grief were contagious. When she asked him about himself, he spoke carefully and honestly in the way of a man who had thought about his own life and was not afraid of what he found there. He had grown up in Ohio, he said, come west at 22 with a cattle drive and stayed, because the space of it had gotten into him in a way that Ohio's greener, more contained landscape had not. He had worked as a hand on several ranches, saved for years, bought his 60 acres, and was building toward something larger, one careful step at a time. "Were you ever married?" she asked, and then felt immediately that she had been too direct, but Homer only shook his head without any particular weight attached to the gesture. "No," he said, "close once. She decided Ohio suited her better than Kansas." He paused. She was right about that. Wilhelmina looked at her coffee cup. "It is not an easy country for everyone," she said. "No," he said, "but for some people it is the right country." He looked at her when he said this, and she looked back at him, and the evening light made everything warm, and the silence between them had a quality that she had not felt in a long time, a quality of being seen and seeing, of two people standing in a clearing together and recognizing the ground underfoot. She was the one who looked away first, not from discomfort, but from some instinct of self-protection that she had not finished examining yet. "You should start back before full dark," she said. "The road is rough in places." "It is," he agreed, and stood, and thanked her for the meal, and rode out into the blue Kansas evening, and she watched from the porch until the sound of his horse faded, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time without doing anything in particular. June came and brought with it a dry spell that worried her for 2 weeks until the storms rolled in from the southwest and solved the problem in a single impressive afternoon. The wheat harvest went well, with Homer lending her Charlie Foster and his muscles for 3 days, and she lending Homer Eli for the same duration. And by midsummer, she had wheat sold to the grain merchant in Colby Creek, and money coming back into her accounts that felt like the ranch beginning to breathe on its own. The town of Colby Creek had mostly absorbed her by this point. People did not stop and stare when she walked down the main street anymore, though Venable, who apparently ran a small cattle operation east of town, still looked at her with the sour expression of a man who would never forgive her for spending more money than him. She did not particularly require his forgiveness. She had made a friend of sorts in a woman named Beatrice Carlyle, who kept the millinery shop and who had the wonderful quality of saying exactly what she thought at all times. Beatrice was 42, widowed herself 3 years prior, and had the settled authority of a woman who had been through the fire and come out the other side with her sense of humor intact. "Homer Winslow has come to town twice this week," Beatrice said one morning in July, looking out her shop window at nothing in particular. "He bought nails the first time and a new rope the second time, neither of which required him to ride 7 miles into town when the hardware in Harlan is 4 miles closer to his property." Wilhelmina was examining a length of ribbon with more attention than it warranted. "He does his business in Colby Creek," she said. "He does his business in Colby Creek," Beatrice agreed serenely. "And both times he walked past my shop, and both times he looked at your wagon outside the general store before he looked at anything else." "You are imagining things," Wilhelmina said. Beatrice smiled at her reflection in the window and said nothing, and Wilhelmina set down the ribbon and went home with a great deal to think about. It was in July that Venable made his first serious move, which was not against Wilhelmina directly, but in a way that circled her. She heard about it from Santos, who heard it from a man in town, that Venable had been going around claiming that the Granger land sale had procedural errors, that the county had not followed proper auction protocols, and that he intended to file a challenge with the county court. She went to see the county recorder herself the following morning, a quiet man named Hadwick who kept excellent files. He showed her the auction records and confirmed that every step of the process had been properly documented. He also told her with the careful neutrality of a government employee that Venable had indeed been in to inquire about the procedure the previous week, but that after examining the records, his attorney had apparently advised him he had no case. "There is no challenge being filed, Mrs. Boone," Hadwick said. "The sale is solid." She thanked him and went to see the town's lawyer, a patient man named Abernathy, who confirmed the same and also told her that Venable's real grievance was that he had wanted the creek access for his cattle and had expected to buy the land cheaply and been outbid by someone he had not accounted for. "He is not a man who accepts surprises gracefully," Abernathy said. "No," Wilhelmina agreed. "He is not." She rode home feeling the particular kind of tiredness that came not from physical work, but from the constant low-level effort of being a woman who owned something in a world that was still deciding whether it approved of her owning it. She unsaddled her horse in the barn and stood there for a moment in the cool dimness, her hands on the horse's warm flank, thinking about all of it. Homer's voice from the barn door startled her, though she did not show it. "Santos told me you went to see Hadwick," he said from the doorway, and there was a careful quality in his voice, as if he was trying to find the right distance between concern and intrusion. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway with the afternoon light behind him. "He has no case," she said. "The auction was clean." He nodded, looking at her with an expression that was serious and something else underneath. "If he makes trouble, there are people in this county who will stand up and say what they saw at that auction," he said, "including me." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "I just want you to know that." "I do know it, Homer," she said, and his name came out of her mouth without her planning it, naturally and plainly, and she saw something in his expression that she recognized from the evening in the kitchen, that same quality of clearing, of ground underfoot. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Beatrice Carlyle stopped me on the street this morning and told me to stop buying hardware I do not need and to say what I mean." Wilhelmina blinked, and then, for the first time in months, she laughed, a genuine, full laugh that came up from somewhere below her carefully maintained composure, and it surprised her almost as much as it surprised him. He looked at her with something in his face that was entirely unguarded and entirely earnest. "She is not wrong," he said quietly. She stopped laughing, and they looked at each other in the barn with the dust motes moving in the bar of light from the door, and the moment had a density to it, the way that certain moments did, when everything that had been moving slowly suddenly arrived at a point. "What would you say," she asked, equally quietly, "if you said what you mean?" He took a breath. "I would say that since the morning you walked into the middle of my argument at the livery stable and told me to keep a second copy of my documents, I have not been able to stop thinking about you." He paused. "I would say that I have a great deal of respect for you and something else that is stronger than respect, and I do not want to push it on you before you are ready for it, or before you want it, or if you never want it at all. But Beatrice Carlyle told me to say what I mean, and so that is what I mean." Wilhelmina looked at him for a long moment, long enough that a lesser man might have retreated from the exposure of what he had said. He did not retreat. He just waited, with the patient honesty that she had come to recognize as the particular quality of him. She thought about Reuben. She thought about the hat which was on her head. She thought about what Reuben would say, and she knew with a clarity that went below thought and into something more certain, that Reuben would say what he had always said, which was not to waste time being afraid of things that were worth having. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have been thinking about you too, and that I have been working very hard not to notice that I was doing it." He did not move toward her, and she respected this, because it was the right thing, to let the thing she had just said exist in the air between them for a moment before anything else happened. "I have not been ready," she said honestly. "I am not entirely sure that I am ready now." "Reuben has not been gone a year." "I know," he said, "but I am not willing to pretend I do not feel what I feel," she said, "because life is short and I have learned that lesson as clearly as a lesson can be learned." He looked at her with eyes that were soft and direct at once. "Then I am not going anywhere," he said, "and neither are you, and we have time." That was the beginning. It was not an impulsive beginning which suited both of them. What happened between Wilhelmina and Homer Winslow over the following months had the quality of something being built rather than something that arrived all at once, and this was its particular beauty, that each step was chosen, and each step meant something, and nothing was rushed or wasted. He came to the ranch regularly now without pretending it was for other reasons. He helped with work, because there was always work, and she helped with his, because there was always work on his place too, and the labor they did alongside each other had a wordless quality of partnership that felt more intimate, in its daily way, than many louder declarations. He brought her things that were thoughtful rather than expensive. A book of botanical illustrations he found in a box at the general store's back room, knowing she had expressed interest in identifying the creekside plants. A specific size of wire staple that Santos had mentioned being hard to source. Once, absurdly, a perfectly round piece of rose quartz from the creek bank that he had apparently picked up because it was beautiful and thought she might like it, and which she placed on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light came through it pink and warm. She brought him things too. She taught him what she had learned from Clement's ledgers about the land's deeper patterns, the places where water ran below the surface, the seasonal wind patterns that affected the northwest pasture. She told him what she was reading each week, and he listened to her analysis of Clement's 20 years of record-keeping with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was actually thinking about it. They talked about everything. About cattle and grass and weather, and what the railroad might do if it extended the line west, and about the politics of the territory, and about what justice meant in a place that was still making its laws as it went. They disagreed sometimes, which was one of the better things, because they could disagree without either of them becoming brittle about it, and the conversation that came after a disagreement was often better than the one before. In September, when the harvest was in and the cattle were moved to the winter pasture, Homer asked her if she would ride with him to the county social in Colby Creek. He asked her directly, not as a business partner, and she said yes directly. And when she walked into that social hall beside Homer Winslow, it was the first public declaration they had made, and they both knew it, and the room knew it, and Beatrice Carlyle looked very pleased with herself indeed. Venable was there. He was always there. He watched Wilhelmina across the room with an expression she had learned to read as wounded pride rather than genuine threat, and she gave him the civil nod of a woman who had nothing to apologize for and went to dance with Homer, who turned out to be a better dancer than his general seriousness suggested. Dancing with him was the first time she had been that close to him for that long, and the warmth of his hand through the back of her dress was a simple, physical thing that she did not try to think past. And when the music ended, they stood for a moment still close together, and she could feel his breath and see the angles of his face in the lamplight. And he looked at her with an expression that was careful and deep and entirely intent. "Wilhelmina," he said softly, and it was the first time he had used her full name, and she had not known until that moment how much it would matter, hearing her own name in his voice. "Homer," she said back, just as softly, and they both understood that something had shifted again. He did not kiss her that night. He walked her to her wagon, thanked her for the evening with a gravity that held its warmth inside it, and helped her up to the seat, and his hand held hers a moment longer than necessary, and she let it. October turned the prairie grass to gold and copper, and the cottonwoods along the creek became columns of bright yellow fire. One afternoon in mid-October, she was alone at the ranch, Santos and Eli having gone to town for supplies, and she was on the porch with Clement's ledgers and a cup of tea when Homer rode up unannounced. He looked, when he dismounted, as if he had been riding for a while and thinking for longer, and there was something in his expression that was different from his usual settled calm. He tied his horse and came to the porch and looked at her. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat and put his hat on his knee and looked at the golden distance for a moment and then back at her. "I have been thinking about the winter," he said, "and about next year and about all the years after that, and I find that in all of it I keep thinking about you in a way that is not just about partnership or business or neighbor." He paused. "I know you have not been free long. I know that grief does not keep to a schedule. I'm not asking you to rush past anything." He looked at her with great steadiness. "But I am asking you to tell me honestly whether you think that there is a future for us together in the way I mean. Because if there is, I would like to start planning for it, and if there is not, I would rather know that now and learn to be your neighbor and nothing else." Wilhelmina set down her cup of tea. She looked at this man, this good, careful, serious, steady man, and she felt the full weight of who she was and who he was and what had grown between them in these months, felt it as clearly and solidly as she felt the wood of the porch chair under her hands. "I believe," she said, "that Reuben would have liked you a great deal, and I believe he would have said so very loudly and with no subtlety whatsoever, because he was that kind of man. Homer's expression was very still and very attentive. "I also believe," she said, "that the life I am building here is the life I was supposed to build, and that you are the person I was supposed to build it with. Not instead of Reuben, but after. The way that spring comes after winter. It is a different season, not a replacement for the other, but its own true thing." He was looking at her with eyes that were full of something she now had a name for, had had a name for it for a while if she was honest, which she was. "I love you," she said, plainly, the way she did everything, with the directness of a woman who had lived enough to know that plainness was a kindness, not a deficiency. "I believe I have been loving you for months and telling myself I was not ready, but the truth is that I have been ready and I was afraid, and I have decided to stop being afraid of good things." He reached across and took her hand, and the autumn afternoon held them both in its warm gold, and he said, "I love you, Wilhelmina. I have loved you since you told me to keep a second copy of my contract, and probably before that, and I will keep loving you for the rest of my life if you will let me." She looked at his face and thought how extraordinary it was, that the world had brought her here to this porch, to this land, through all of it, and set this man in front of her, and she was not going to waste a single moment of what that meant. "I will let you," she said, and he brought her hand up and pressed it to his mouth, and the sun was gold on the cottonwoods, and the grass was copper, and everything was exactly right. November brought the cold and with it the question of the practical future, because Wilhelmina was a practical woman and practicality was one of the things she loved about herself. She and Homer talked about everything, as had always been their way, and they talked about what a marriage between them would look like with the same directness they brought to conversations about pasture rotation and grazing fees. He would move to the Granger land, which was her land, which would become their land. His 60 acres would be leased out, which would add to their combined income. His cattle would be merged with hers, and the operation would have the scale it needed to be genuinely profitable. She would keep the ranch management, because she was doing it well and they both knew it. He would take primary responsibility for the cattle work, because he knew cattle in his bones and they both knew that too. She told him about the money she had sewn into her coat and the crown of Reuben's hat the day of the auction, and he listened to this with an expression that contained an enormous amount at once, respect and sorrow and affection and humor, all of it held carefully together. "You walked into that auction yard with $1,000 hidden on your body and outbid 30 men, he said. 850, she corrected. "I had 850 and I bid 1,000, and I was prepared to let the bid stand and work something out later if I had to." He shook his head slowly, and the expression on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life, that particular look of a man who is looking at the person he loves and seeing all of them. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said. "Both can be true," he said. They were married in December, in the Colby Creek church, which was small and cold and smelled of pine from the branches someone had hung, and Beatrice Carlyle cried openly and without apology, and Santos stood in the back with his arms folded and looked more pleased than she had ever seen him, and Eli Watts, who had grown considerably in the months he had worked for her, stood straight and watched with the serious attention of a young man witnessing something he intended to remember. The wedding was simple, as both of them preferred. There was no elaborate dress. She wore her best dark blue wool, and she wore Reuben's hat, because she had explained to Homer that she needed to, and because Homer had not questioned this for a single moment, had instead looked at the hat with a kind of reverence for what it represented, the road that had brought her to him. After the ceremony, standing in the cold church with the thin Kansas winter light coming through the windows, Homer looked at her with his ring on his finger and she with hers, and she thought that she had never been more certain of anything in her life. "No regrets," he said, which was not a question really, or it was a question that already knew its answer. "None," she said, and kissed him, and meant it with everything she had. The winter they spent together in the limestone house was the winter that would become the measure for all winters after it. It was cold, deeply cold in the Kansas way that the wind made absolute, and they worked together and ate together and talked by the fire in the evenings. And she learned the particular domestic architecture of a man who had lived alone for years, the habits and preferences and morning silences, and he learned hers. And the learning of each other was a pleasure she had not anticipated, the daily discovery of a person. He had a habit of reading before sleep, history and natural philosophy, the kind of books that accumulated in a man's life when he took his mind seriously. And she would wake some nights to find the lamp still lit and him deeply absorbed in something about which he would tell her the next morning over coffee with the focused enthusiasm of a man who had been thinking about it since 3 in the morning. She loved this about him. She told him so. He loved that she counted things, lists and numbers, the way her mind moved through problems by quantifying them. He told her once that he thought she would have been a brilliant accountant in another life, and she had laughed and said that in this life she was a rancher, which was better. The question of Venable resolved itself in February in a way that closed it permanently. He made one final attempt at aggression, which was to send 2 of his hands over to move the boundary markers between his small parcel and the creek access that was legally part of the Granger land. Santos discovered it within a day, and Wilhelmina went to Abernathy, and Abernathy sent a very formal letter to Venable's attorney explaining the legal consequences of tampering with property markers in the state of Kansas, and Venable, who was apparently even less brave in writing than in person, backed down entirely. He sold his property 6 months later and moved to Wichita, and no one in Colby Creek appeared to miss him. Spring came again, the anniversary of the auction. Wilhelmina stood on the porch on that second Saturday of April, 1883, 1 year from the day she had walked into the Granger yard in a dead man's hat, and looked at the land that was hers and Homer's together. The grass was coming green and the cottonwoods were budding, and her cattle and Homer's cattle were together in the south pasture, and Santos was checking the fence line on the west, and Eli was in the barn doing the morning feeding, and inside the house her husband was making coffee. She could smell it from the porch. She reached up and touched the brim of Reuben's hat. She thought of him with the particular quality of love that does not diminish but changes, becomes less a wound and more a presence, less a tearing and more a foundation. Homer came through the door with 2 cups of coffee, barefoot despite the cold, because he was a man of many sensible qualities and a few inexplicable ones. He handed her a cup and stood beside her and looked at the same land she was looking at. 1 year, he said. 1 year, she agreed. How does it feel? She thought about it honestly, as she thought about everything. It feels like I have been here my whole life, she said, and also like it is just beginning. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they stood in the April morning, which was the same kind of morning as a year ago, clear and cold and pale blue above the greening grass, and she thought that she had never felt so completely in the right place, which was not a location but a combination, the right land and the right man and the right self, all 3 aligned. Homer, she said. He said, I am going to have a child. He was very still for a moment, the kind of very still that comes right before motion, and then he set down his coffee cup on the porch railing and turned to face her with an expression that was so entirely unguarded and so entirely full of love that she felt it like warmth, like the sun coming over the horizon. When? He said. October, I think, she said. He took her face in his hands with extraordinary gentleness and looked at her as if she was the most remarkable thing he had ever seen, which she supposed, to him, she was, and she supposed that he was to her. Wilhelmina Winslow, he said, her new name in his voice, and she had been Wilhelmina Winslow for 4 months and had never tired of hearing it. Homer Winslow, she said back. He kissed her right there on the porch in the April morning, and she kissed him back with all of it, the grief and the courage and the auction yard, and the $1,000 and the months of careful building and the winter by the fire and the future that was already happening. And it was a very good kiss, which she thought Reuben, somewhere in whatever existence followed this one, would find both appropriate and funny, which was very Reuben. The summer that followed was the busiest she could remember, and it was full in a way that was entirely distinct from the full she had known before, which had been the full of managing and surviving. This full was the full of abundance, actual abundance, the land producing what it was capable of, the operation running with the precision that came from two intelligent people working toward the same thing, the cattle healthy, the accounts in order, Santos and Eli both staying on, and Santos taking on a training role with a third hand they hired in July. A quiet young man named Thomas Redfield, who was from a Cheyenne family that had been pushed steadily east by the reservation system. There was an injustice in this that Wilhelmina did not ignore, and did not pretend, was other than what it was. Thomas Redfield was 20 years old and had more knowledge of the Kansas land, its patterns and seasons, and the behavior of its animals, than any other hand she had ever met, and he was paid what Santos was paid and treated with the same respect she extended to everyone who worked for her, because she had spent enough of her own life being underestimated to have no tolerance whatsoever for doing it to someone else. She saw the slight surprise in Thomas's expression the first week, the careful watchfulness of a young man who expected fair treatment to be revoked, and when it was not revoked and was not conditional, she saw him relax into the work with the ease of a person who had finally been allowed simply to be capable without apology. Homer treated Thomas the same way. She had loved him for many things before this, but watching him work alongside Thomas and talk to him with the genuine respect of a man who was interested in what another man knew, this also went into the collection of things she loved about him, which was growing very large. October came with its gold and copper, the anniversary of the afternoon on the porch when she had told him what she felt, and she delivered a son in the limestone house with the midwife from Colby Creek, a competent, calm woman named Mrs. Forsyth, who had been doing this work for 20 years and radiated the particular authority of expertise. The birth was long and hard, because first births often were, but she came through it with the same stubbornness she brought to everything, and when Mrs. Forsyth put the baby in her arms, red-faced and loudly announcing his arrival, she felt something in her that was entirely new, not replacing anything but being entirely itself. Homer came in when Mrs. Forsyth called him, and he sat beside her on the bed and looked at the baby with an expression that was absolutely helpless, the expression of a man who has just met the person who is going to own a particular piece of his heart for the rest of his life. "He has your eyes," Homer said. "He is 3 hours old," Wilhelmina said. "It is too early to tell." "He has your eyes," Homer said again, more certainly, and he was right. The baby did have her dark eyes, and they both knew it. They named him Clement Reuben Winslow, Clement for the man whose land had given them this life, Reuben for the man whose careful saving had made it possible. The name was a history in 3 words, and she said it the first time with her hand on the baby's head, and felt the history settle around her like something completed rather than something lost. Homer held his son with the careful confidence of a man who had not held many babies but was determined to learn, and he looked at Wilhelmina over the small, warm weight of Clement, and what was in his eyes was the whole story of them, the auction yard and the fence and the kitchen table and the porch and the dancing and the December wedding, all of it, distilled into the fact of this small person between them. "Thank you," he said softly, which was perhaps an odd thing to say, but she understood it perfectly. "Thank you," she said back, and meant it. The winter of 1883 was mild, which was a mercy with a new baby in the house. Clement Reuben Winslow was a serious baby, which his father found enormously entertaining, and his mother found entirely predictable, and he developed, by December, an opinion about most things that he expressed with great volume, which his mother said he had from his father and his father said he had from his mother. And this argument was conducted with so much mutual affection that it constituted a form of entertainment in itself. Santos, who had not previously been known to particularly warm to children, took one look at Clement and became his fiercest protector, which no one predicted and everyone was charmed by. He spent evenings sometimes sitting near the baby's basket, with a kind of quiet contentment that Wilhelmina thought was him being glad for the family of it, the having of it, and she made sure he knew he was part of that family in every real sense. Eli Watts, who was now 18 and had grown from a boy into a capable young man in the 2 years he had been with them, was made permanent ranch hand with a raise and his own room properly outfitted rather than the makeshift arrangement he had been in before. And the pride he took in this was good to see, the particular dignity of a young person being taken seriously. Thomas continued to be excellent at everything, and in the spring of 1884 he asked quietly if he could bring his sister to the ranch, who was 18 and looking for work, and who he said could cook and sew and help with anything needed. Wilhelmina said yes and meant it, and Clara Redfield arrived in April and proved to be everything her brother had said and considerably more, a young woman of bright intelligence and considerable competence who became, within 6 months, as essential to the household as anyone in it. Wilhelmina took particular care to make sure Clara was treated with the same fairness and respect as anyone else, and the two women developed a friendship based initially on practicality and then on genuine liking, which was the best kind. The ranch prospered. In 1884, they expanded the cattle operation to 120 head, which was the number the pasture could properly carry. Homer negotiated a supply contract with a Wichita beef buyer that gave them reliable income. The wheat fields continued to produce. The well, which had never run dry as advertised, continued to not run dry. Clement's ledgers, supplemented now by 3 years of Wilhelmina's additions in her cleaner hand, filled another volume. Colby Creek grew too, as towns did in those years. The railroad extended a spur line, which brought new residents and a proper bank and a second general store, and the town took on the slightly more established air of a place that had decided it was permanent. The church got a real roof. A doctor set up practice. The school expanded to 2 full terms a year. Wilhelmina became, without seeking it, one of the figures the town looked to on certain matters, particularly anything involving land or contracts or disputes about boundaries, because she had a reputation for both fairness and precision that people found useful. She did not seek this role, but she did not avoid it either, because she believed that people who understood things had an obligation to be useful with that understanding. Homer was proud of this in the way he was proud of everything about her, which was not a prideful pride but a deep, quiet, grateful recognition, the pride of a man who looked at his wife and thought, "How extraordinary that this is the person I have." In the spring of 1885, 3 years after the auction, Wilhelmina was in the barn with Santos looking at one of the cattle that had developed a lame leg when she felt the particular quality of mourning that she had come to recognize, the slight unsteadiness, the heightened smell of the barn straw, and she straightened up and said to Santos, with perfect calm, "I believe I am with child again." Santos looked at her for a moment and said, with equal calm, "I will tell Eli to take the afternoon rounds." She laughed, "Thank you, Santos." She told Homer that evening, sitting by the fire with Clement on the rug between them playing with a set of carved wooden blocks that Homer had made for him over the winter. Homer looked up from the book he was reading, looked at her, looked at the way she was looking at him and put the book down. "Again," he said, and his face was doing the same thing it had done the first time, that helplessly open quality. "Again," she said. He got up and came to sit beside her and took her hand. Clement, entirely uninterested in whatever was happening with the adults, knocked over his block tower and looked pleased about it. "A girl this time, maybe," Homer said. "Maybe," she said, "or another boy." "Either way," he said. Either way, she agreed. She delivered in November, and it was a girl this time, a loud and opinionated girl with red hair that came from somewhere mysterious in the family line of one of them, and they named her Josephine Clara Winslow, Clara for the woman who had become Wilhelmina's friend and helpmate, and Josephine because Homer had a grandmother by that name who he said had been the kind of woman who did not ask permission for anything, which seemed appropriate. Josephine lived up to her name from the first week, and the sound of the limestone house in the winter of 1885 was the sound of two small children, one serious and one emphatically not. And it was, by any measure, the best sound Wilhelmina had ever heard. She put Reuben's hat on its hook by the bedroom door, where it had hung since she moved into the house, and she looked at it sometimes in the evenings, in the warm light of the lamp, and felt the full complexity of what it meant, the love it represented and the grief it represented and the journey it had been part of, and she thought of Reuben with gratitude and with peace, the peace of a person who has honored what was given to them by building something real with it. Homer, coming to bed one evening and finding her looking at the hat, stood beside her and looked at it too. "I think of him sometimes," Homer said, "a man I never met. I think I owe him a great deal." "You owe him exactly what I owe him," she said, "everything and nothing. He gave me what he had to give, and now you give me what you have to give, and they are different things and equally real." He put his arm around her. "That is the wisest thing I have heard this week." "It is only Tuesday," she said. He laughed, which was a sound she loved in the particular way she loved all the specific sounds of him, the voice and the laugh and the quiet and the way he said her name. And she turned and kissed him there in the lamplight with the hat on its hook, and the children asleep in the next room, and the January wind outside, and the limestone walls solid around them all. The years settled into what years do when they are good ones, a rhythm that had variety and peace within it, seasons of hard work and seasons of abundance, small dramas that resolved themselves and a few large ones that tested them and were met together. The ranch expanded again in 1887, when a neighboring property came up, and they bought an adjacent 80 acres at an honest price, adding a third pasture and a second barn, and the operation now was large enough to need a careful hand on the accounts, which Wilhelmina gave it, the ledgers in her neat handwriting growing fat with years of good management. In 1888, Clement Reuben Winslow started school, and walked into the Colby Creek schoolhouse with his father's steady eyes and his mother's straight spine, and sat down at a desk with the seriousness of a boy who had been thinking about learning his whole life. He came home that first afternoon and told them everything that had happened with the focused urgency of someone reporting important events, and both Wilhelmina and Homer listened to every word, and she caught Homer's eye over their son's head, and something passed between them that was the whole of it, the love and the years, and the weight of having built something that was now growing on its own. In 1889, when Josephine was 4 and had been walking since 10 months and talking since 11, and had definite opinions about everything already and expressed them without the slightest hesitation, Thomas Redfield came to Homer and Wilhelmina one evening with the particular manner of a man who had something significant to say. He told them that he had been offered a small piece of land in the next county by a man who was moving east, good land at a price he could afford if he saved for another year, and that he wanted to try ranching for himself. He told them this with a straightforwardness that was exactly what she had hoped to see in him, the confidence of a man who had been treated with fairness long enough that he trusted his own capability. Wilhelmina and Homer looked at each other, and she saw in Homer's expression the same thing she felt, which was the pride of having been part of this, having been part of a person's development toward their own life. "You have more than earned it," Homer said. "You are a good rancher, Thomas," Wilhelmina said. "You know this land and you know cattle and you are fair with people. You will do well." Thomas Redfield looked at both of them with the expression of a man who has been prepared by good people for the thing he is about to do, and the weight of that in his face was the weight of gratitude, genuine and quiet. He stayed through the harvest of that year and left in October with a horse and wages saved, and a handshake from Homer and an embrace from Wilhelmina and a packed meal from Clara, who shed several tears that she absolutely refused to acknowledge, and rode out toward his own future, and they watched him go from the porch, and it was one of the good goodbyes, the kind that were a completion rather than a loss. Santos stayed. He was 57 by then, and showing the weather of his years in his face and his joints, and Wilhelmina had told him plainly 2 years prior that he had a place at the ranch for as long as he wanted it, that there was no expectation of him leaving and no version of the future she was imagining that did not include him in it. He had looked at her when she said this with eyes that were full and said nothing for a long moment, and then said, "You are a good woman, Mrs. Winslow," with the emphasis of a man who meant the fullness of what he was saying. Clara stayed too, and was now managing the household with the authority of a woman who had grown entirely into herself, and who had recently begun a correspondence with a schoolteacher in Colby Creek that had a particular quality to it that Wilhelmina recognized and chose not to comment on, except to make sure Clara had every reason to feel that her own happiness was entirely supported and desired. Eli Watts had left them in 1886 for his own piece of ground, helped along by the raise they had given him and the savings he had built, and his going had been another good goodbye, and they heard from him periodically by letter, reports of his progress that made her feel the specific satisfaction of having been one of the places where a person became who they needed to be. Spring of 1890, 8 years since the auction. Wilhelmina stood in the yard in the April morning, holding Josephine on her hip, because Josephine had refused to walk the last 20 feet from the porch on the grounds that she was tired, which Josephine always was until something interesting happened, and then she was not. Clement was at school. Homer was in the barn with the 2 new hands they had taken on, going through the morning feeding. Santos was checking the creek fence. Clara was in the kitchen, and the smell of breakfast was coming from the house in a warm cloud that mixed with the spring air in a way that was entirely, essentially home. Wilhelmina looked at the land. 492 acres now, including the adjacent purchase. The limestone house that had become her home in the truest sense of the word, the walls she knew better than her own face. The barn, sound and painted, the well that had never run dry. She looked at the hat, which she was wearing as she still did sometimes on mornings when the memory of Reuben sat close and needed honoring. She touched the brim. Josephine reached up and touched the hat too, with small serious fingers, which she did sometimes, drawn to it by some instinct. "That was your grandfather Reuben's hat," Wilhelmina told her daughter, as she had told her before and would tell her again. "Grandpa Reuben," Josephine said, with the gravity of a 4-year-old handling important information. "He was a very good man," Wilhelmina said. "He saved very carefully and he loved very well, and because of him we are standing here." Josephine considered this. "And Papa," she said. "And Papa," Wilhelmina agreed, "found us here." Homer came out of the barn and crossed the yard, and he looked at her, as he always did, with that full, honest attention that had never dimmed in 8 years, the attention of a man who was still, every day, interested in the person he had married. He saw her hand on the brim of the hat and he smiled, the particular smile that was for her, and he came and stood beside her and put his arm around her, and Josephine climbed immediately from Wilhelmina's hip onto Homer's, with the efficient opportunism of a child who understood who was the softer carry, and Homer held his daughter and looked at his wife and looked at the land and took a long breath of the spring morning. "Good day," he said. "Good day," she agreed. "I have been thinking," he said, "about extending the east fence line and trying to bring in another 20 acres of wheat. The soil report from last fall suggests it would produce well." "I read the same report," she said. "I agree. We could start the clearing in May. We could start in late April if Thomas sends his new hand to help, which he offered. Homer looked at her with that expression, the one that contained all of it. "You already wrote to Thomas." "I wrote to Thomas 2 weeks ago," she said. He laughed, and Josephine laughed because her father laughed, and in the kitchen Clara was singing something to herself in a low voice. And somewhere in the south pasture, the cattle were moving through the new grass in the particular unhurried way of animals who were well, and the cottonwoods along the creek were brilliant with their first spring green, and the sky above the flat Kansas horizon was every shade of blue that blue had ever been. Wilhelmina thought, in that moment, of the woman she had been when she drove her wagon into Colby Creek 8 years ago. The woman in the dead man's hat with $480 in a tin, and 300 more from the sale of everything she owned, and the absolute stubbornness of a person who had decided to survive, and then decided that surviving was not enough, that living was required, real living, the kind that was built with both hands in the actual earth of the actual world. She thought of that woman with great tenderness and great respect. She thought of Reuben, who had believed in that woman before she did. And she stood in the April morning with her husband's arm around her, and her daughter on his hip, and her land spread before her in all its spring gold and green. And she felt, with a completeness she had not known she was capable of feeling, that everything which had needed to happen had happened, and everything which needed to be built had been built, and the life she was living was exactly and entirely the life she was supposed to live. Josephine reached up again and touched the brim of the hat, and Wilhelmina let her. Homer pressed his lips to Wilhelmina's hair, and she leaned into him, and the morning held them both. The hat stayed on its hook in the evenings. In the mornings, sometimes, she wore it still, because it was her history and her honor and her beginning, and because the woman who had walked into that auction yard alone and said $1,000 into the silence of 30 skeptical men deserved to be remembered, and because the best way to remember her was to be her still, in every way that mattered. She was her. She was also Homer Winslow's wife, and Clement and Josephine's mother, and Santos's employer and Clara's friend, and Thomas Redfield's former colleague, and the woman that the town of Colby Creek had quietly and without ceremony decided was one of its own. She was Wilhelmina Boone Winslow, and the Granger land was her land, and the limestone house was her home, and the man beside her was her love, and the life she had built from a tin of money and a dead man's hat and one act of absolute, stubborn courage was the only life she had ever needed. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.